Today's question is on God and science. John Lennox and Michael Ruse debate on this issue, so let's watch the video.
The starting question is, though, when it comes to modern science, do you both share a kind of view that it does owe something to the Judeo-Christian sort of foundations, if you like, of Britain and the West? What's your view on that, John?
I think very much so. I remember as a teenager being subjected by a friend to reading Alfred North Whitehead, and he's a difficult philosopher, as you know, but I remember coming across the notion that the rise of modern science was due to the the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. And then later, reading C.S. Lewis, who summed it up in slightly easier language, he said men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So in one sense, I am delighted to be both a scientist, if you allow a mathematician to say he's a scientist, which is another matter, and a believer in God, because arguably it was the Christian cradle that gave birth to my subject. And I noticed, of course, subsequently, many people who weren't necessarily Christian, like Melvin Calvin, who won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, and he said, as I look back to ask where this belief in order came from, that's fundamental to all science. In fact, it's the fundamental faith of scientists. We can't do science unless we look for order in nature. He says that it came from an idea first mooted by the ancient Hebrews and then communicated later in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And John Hedley Brooke, who was an expert historian of science, is perhaps, well, he is more nuanced than I would be and a little bit more cautious, but nevertheless, the tenor of the argument is that certainly there's a deep connection for a very obvious reason. If you believe that behind the universe there's a rational mind, then you expect to be able to do science. So that I would put the two together quite strongly.
Well, firstly, do you agree that there is a sort of Judeo-Christian heritage that has informed the modern science? But also, how far do you go along John's line that an orderly science presupposes a sort of orderly mind at some level behind it?
Well, I think it has done in the past. Yes, first of all, I agree with John. I think that modern science owes a great... I mean, you know, we want to say we've got to be broad and we've got to bring in Buddhism and all of these, but the simple fact of the matter is modern science owes basically its being to Christianity. I mean, at least the science that we have, and I'm sure we'll talk about Darwinism, and I would say it owes its being to Anglican Christianity. But certainly, I think that you're quite right to say that modern science owes its being to Christianity. Now, John and I were talking just before. We both you took courses with her. I was very much influenced by a woman called Mary Hesse, who was a professor at Cambridge at philosophy. And she made a great deal of metaphor. And I've bought into this hook, line, and sinker, that I don't think that science is just, like Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Science is interpretation. Mm-hmm. Science is the facts as you put them together and make sense of it. And I think the key is metaphor. Now, up until the scientific revolution, the key metaphor, that what linguists call the root metaphor, was that of an organism. The world was seen as organic. I mean, Plato in the Timaeus comes right out with that, but Aristotle too. I think there was a change of metaphor. I'm not saying anything that John Hedley Brooke and others wouldn't say. There was a change in metaphor to that of a machine. Now, of course, to a certain extent, it was fueled by the fact that we now had more and more sophisticated machines, and particularly clocks. I mean, this was the big one. So I think that more and more in the scientific revolution, the world was being looked at as a machine made by the divine engineer. And what happened was this became tremendously powerful by the end of the 16th and certainly into the 17th century. And you read people like Robert Boyle and all of these others. They're using the machine metaphor all the time. The thing was, though, that more and more people found, as much as doing science was concerned, God wasn't very helpful. That, to use the language of today, you just had to get on with being a methodological naturalist and leave, as it were, metaphysical naturalism, the question of God or no God, out. And as one of the great historians of the scientific revolution said, eventually God became a retired engineer. When they started with the machine, of course, it was looked at in terms of this is good, who was the divine creator? But as I say, I think as the years went by, it wasn't because people were necessarily irreligious. Many of them, like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, were very religious. But they found increasingly, as scientists, it wasn't necessary, and it wasn't very helpful to bring God into the discussion. Descartes says this. Now, the fact is, they wanted to go on believing in God, but it started to make the way possible for what Richard Dawkins has called, you could be an intellectually justified atheist. They were not atheists in the 17th century, but it was the thin end of a very big wedge.
Do you agree with that assessment, John?
To a certain extent. I think we have to recognize as well that it depends what area of your science you're talking about. I'm a pure mathematician, and when I teach pure mathematics, I don't mention God at all. And if I was designing the rocket locomotive that George Stephenson designed, we don't mention God at all. God doesn't arise in the vast amount of the practicalities of science, even biology. Where the deeper questions come are, why can we do science at all? What is it about this universe that allows us to do science? And there I would begin to see the fingerprint of a divine mind. So that it's not so much in the mechanisms. Now, there are exceptions to that, because when you raise questions of origins, inevitably, if you look at the history of ideas, you'll see that the question of God comes up a great deal. And God as the one who creates the universe and sustains it. But you'll not find God at the bottom of the piston cylinder in an automobile engine. And of course you won't. And the danger is that because that kind of practical science was so successful in spinning off technology, people then began to take what I regard as a completely illegitimate step. And that is to do away with God altogether. And the main reason for that is the notion that science cannot answer every question. Scientism is rampant today, and I think it's dangerously false.
Just explain what scientism is.
Well, it's the idea that science is the only way to truth. And of course, as a statement, if I say science is the only way to truth, that's logically self-contradictory, because that statement is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. Perhaps it's a bit too early in the evening for logic like that. But the point is this, that many people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking regard science as the only way to truth. Well, that would shut down your department of philosophy, and that would be absurd. And Cambridge Philosophy Department reacted very severely to Hawking's statement.
Before Michael comes...
Okay, so let's just stop the video now and let me explain the key concepts, and hopefully I am able to explain an easy way for you to understand. So of course this channel is for Christians, so it's going to have a Christian worldview perspective on different things. So the main debate question right here for this first part of the debate, John Lennox and Michael Ruse are actually talking about the fact that God cannot be found in the mechanism of science. That means God cannot be explicitly found in the mechanism of science. So let me give you an example of science, engineering, creation of a car, right? That's a form of science, or applied science, therefore engineering, right? In a car, we don't see the mechanic anywhere, meaning that when we take apart a car, like what John Lennox was saying, you won't find God in the piston. You won't find God under the pistons. You won't find God in anywhere of the engine. But the creation of a car still means that but the existence of a car would mean that there is a mechanic that created the car. But through the mechanism of how it's created, we may not see the mechanic in the car anymore, but we'll still see the car, the proof that mechanic exists. And therefore that's point 2. And then point 3, John Lennox is saying that God is the agency of the living world. So God is the agency that created the car per se. So God is the mechanic that created the car. So I think the two main concepts that I realize John Lennox always says is always mechanism and agency. So mechanism in respect of a car is the way the car is made. So it is the steps that the car is made, the order that the car is made, which the debate they talk about order. So John Lennox is saying that order is important for science to present itself, because if an atheist doesn't believe in order, or form of order created by higher being, therefore there won't be order, because atheism doesn't believe in order, and therefore science cannot exist without order, because science is a thing of science is created based on order. Yeah, and then after that, so that's mechanism. Mechanism is more like how the car is made, and agency is why the mechanic made the car, or the purpose of why the mechanic made the car. So these two things are very important to understand, because mechanism is how science functions, about how things exist, about how gravity exists, about how forces exist and interact with each other. But for science, there's no form of agency in it, there's no form of purpose in it, unless a person gives purpose for it. But therefore, as a Christian, we understand that science is true, because science is not true, but science is more a way that people understand the mechanisms of life, how things work in life, like how a car is built, how buildings are built. All these things are mechanisms of life. But there's always an agency, there's always an agent, a person that's actually operating on creating the car, making the car, designing the car. And mechanism is more of the science aspect, but science cannot explain agency, science cannot explain why things are created. And therefore John Lennox argues that that we need to have agency to really understand how things are created. So this is the core argument. It's about order, mechanism, and agency. And if you like videos like this for Christian apologetics, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. See you in the next video.